Like, my brother's gone. A life is gone. He's never coming back. So in a sense, I feel life for life. You took his life, I feel like you should spend the rest of yours behind bars.
They observe him, walk up behind him, and shoot him once in the head. And he did this motion to them as he walked past, as if to suggest, shh.
This reeked of revenge.
How do you walk past the site where your brother was murdered? How do you move on from something that is in your face every single day?
He told Saquon, whenever I see you, I'm just gonna handle the situation.
My grandmother used to always say, you try to dig a ditch for someone else that you're gonna fall in.
July 2nd, 2016, in the sprawling suburbs of Northern Virginia. After a late night out, 22-year-old Kentrice Hall is getting ready for bed when she's interrupted by a terrifying call.
I literally just took my dress off and laid in the bed. I was so tired. I was on the phone, and I keep getting this call from this guy. I know he likes me, and he's from, uptown. And I'm like, what did he want? So I finally answered the phone, maybe the third call, and he's like, your brother, he just got shot. I'm like, what? Like, I immediately jumped up, and I'm telling my mom, like, get the F up. Like, Saquon has been shot. We have to go now.
When Kentrice told me that, I just freaked out. It was like one of my worst fears coming to fruition. I don't change clothes or anything. We both get in the car and we're on our way.
The pair head to the place where the shooting occurred.
I did maybe 80 all the way down the street. I put the hazards on, so I was able to fly.
Kentrice's brother, 23-year-old Saquon Hall, has gotten into his share of trouble before. But this time, it feels different.
When I get there, the whole street is lit up. A lot of people standing outside. There's paramedics.
And I'm running up the street saying, where's my son? He wasn't in the ambulance. They were, I think, putting him on the stretcher. But everything seemed like it was in slow motion. I'm praying, I'm hollering, Saquon, hold on.
Saquon Hall was born on November 7th, 1992. And he and his 4 siblings grew up in a low-income Northern Virginia neighborhood.
The 3 oldest boys are actually 5 years apart. And then there was Saquon.
Me and Saquon are very close in age. You couldn't tell if we weren't twins growing up. My mom would buy 2 of the same shoes, just different sizes. He was always the person in the grade before me, so everyone knew that I was coming.
He was always cutting up in school. He was just a class clown. Everybody loved him. He was a good guy.
Saquon's aunts and uncles lived on the same block, so he was always surrounded by family. But Saquon had a special relationship with his father.
He liked to play football a lot, and Saquon's dad was his football coach. Saquon was a really good player, very fast, light on his feet.
When his father died, Saquon was only 8 years old. It turned his entire world upside down.
Once his dad died, it was just like, no more football. Like, he would watch the Cowboys, of course, but he didn't want to play anymore.
It's very difficult when children lose a parent. Very difficult. And for Saquon, he didn't have a strong male role model in his life.
As he grew older, Saquon became his own role model, taking care of his mother and sister, as well as his close friends.
He was very much outspoken. He let you know, if there was any injustice or wrong, he would say it.
You come to him with a problem, he made it his problem. One time, I think I was in the 6th grade, Saquon was in the 7th grade, and we were walking across our middle school football field to get to my mom's job. And all of a sudden, you seen Saquon's friend getting like body slammed by a police officer, and Saquon being the person that he is, like he ran over there, to like diffuse the situation. They started to, of course, body slam Saquon as well. And I'm standing there looking like, what? I'm just like screaming. They took him down to the police station and all that, and that was Saquon's very first, incident with the law.
As a result, Saquon's mother decided to relocate the family to a different area of town.
My mom was like, I'm done with it. We're moving from the projects, we're moving to the west side, and it's gonna be a better life for everyone.
But for Saquon, it was hard adjusting to a new neighborhood.
The first 2 or 3 months, he was catching the bus and would be gone all day in our old neighborhood.
I would have to go looking for him to find out where he was. I just didn't like the crowd that he was hanging with.
Saquon began spending more and more time on the streets. To keep him out of trouble, his mother encouraged him to volunteer at a local soup kitchen.
I'm a minister, and I was the advocate helping those in public housing. My children were always there with me to help me clean up. I tried to raise my kids with how to be proactive, and just love everybody.
But it was a high school classmate who finally got Saquon to settle down. Her name was Takia Johnson. And not long after graduation, she and Saquon had a child together.
He was 19 or 20 when the kids came. Well, when the first child came, which was a girl. Loved her.
Things started to definitely change. Everything was about Skylar and this and Skylar that. I know that definitely brought a different side to him. And then slowly after that, Imari came, and then it was like a dad of 2, and it was just like, what are you going to do?
Then, in 2015, Saquon's turn at fatherhood nearly came to an end when he was shot for the first time.
I remember it's kind of cold, late at night, and we got a call saying that he was shot. So we, of course, immediately ran to the hospital. And there was detectives there trying to hound him to see who shot him.
He wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't say anything. I figured he was trying to honor the street code.
Saquon's loved ones hoped the brush with death would slow him down. In the weeks since the shooting, Saquon was focusing on his family and talked about going back to school to become an HVAC repairman.
I could tell he wanted to be like a fun dad. All of that long nights going out and stuff like that, he definitely changed.
But now, a second shooting has left Saquon fighting for his life. And his mother finds herself praying, once again, for his recovery.
As they were taking Saquon to the hospital, she rode in the back. And the whole time that she was riding with him, she was thinking, maybe this is just another minor shooting. Maybe he'll get through this.
As the ambulance speeds away, police begin their investigation.
Crime scene investigators responded, of course, and processed the crime scene. They found multiple shell casings, I believe 16 shell casings, all of which were from a 9mm.
There were shell casings found up and down First Street. You can see that the shooter was not standing in the same place while he was shooting.
Police recovered 2 revolvers nearby. Neither of them matches the 9mm shell casings at the scene, due to one clear explanation.
A semi-automatic weapon will kick out the shell casings. When you fire a revolver, the shell casing remains in the gun.
It was unclear to us if those weapons were ever discharged that night.
To a detective, it says that there were other guns on the scene. It could have been somebody else. It could have been the shooter having more than one gun. Who had it? Who was shooting is what the investigation reveals.
As 23-year-old Saquon Hall is rushed to a Northern Virginia hospital in critical condition, investigators question witnesses at the scene. His sister, Kentrice Hall, tells detectives they'd spent the night hosting an event together.
The night of July 1st, we had a big party. We had like a celebrity guest come. Me, Saquon, and a bunch of our friends worked very hard selling tickets for the event. But that night, it was like really weird. He was very standoffish. You could tell that he was like watching what was going on around him, or like he just wasn't there.
The party ended around midnight, and Kentrice headed home. But Saquon wasn't quite ready to call it a night.
Saquon had said he was going, with his friends. So they went uptown to the projects where one of his friends lived.
They all returned to someone's house to kind of continue hanging out. There was a large group of people who went back there.
According to Saquon's friends, the attack took place shortly after they got to the house. They'd had a few drinks when Saquon suddenly decided to leave with two young women.
At some point there, he left the residence where he was with two individuals in a car, drove a short way away. He gets out of the car. The two female individuals remained in the car. Shortly thereafter, there was a lot of gunfire.
The women say they saw Saquon running back toward the car seconds later.
Saquon was trying to escape from somebody who was pursuing him, and then one shot hit him and he fell to the ground. While he was down on the ground, the person pursuing him came up from behind and shot him again.
He was shot twice. He was shot in the back and in the back of the head.
When police ask for a description of the shooter, the witnesses become reluctant to talk.
Neither of these individuals had like a lengthy history with Saquon or deep connections to him. I kind of think they were just girls he was hanging out with. They'd all been out at the club that night.
All of these young people had this snitches bring stitches. We don't rat on anyone, that type thing.
Investigators will need to find another way to identify a suspect. Luckily, the weapons found near the scene provide a potential lead.
The guns that were recovered had serial numbers, and they were researched to find out that a Edna Conte had purchased these guns.
Edna Conte is a 22-year-old resident of the Northern Virginia area. And as police quickly discover, she has bought a total of 8 guns in the past 2 months.
A 22-year-old needing 8 guns? Who is this?
Investigators immediately contact Edna, who claims there's a perfectly innocent explanation.
Edna Conte said that she had purchased these 8 guns because she was getting death threats from her boyfriend. And she relayed that she was starting to have suicidal thoughts, so she was going to get rid of the guns. And on the way to get rid of the guns, the car broke down, was towed to the shop, and the guns were subsequently stolen.
But detectives aren't buying it.
There are many lies in homicide investigations, and this was one of them. It appeared that Edna Conte was buying these guns for other people to be put out on the street, making what they call a straw purchase of firearms.
The question is, who wound up with the guns? As police search for answers, Saquon's loved ones gather at the hospital for news of his condition.
I wanted more than anything for my baby to live. I didn't want it to be serious, but it was. The doctors were working on him. They wouldn't let me see him.
Unfortunately, his wounds proved to be too severe.
I don't know if he was bleeding out. Like, they really never gave us too much information on that, but all I know is when they came to us and told him that his time had expired, my mom just like fell out, like in the middle of the floor, body collapsed.
My thoughts and emotions were all over the place. I was devastated. I was in shock.
I couldn't believe it. We all just standing there like he was just here. Like we was just talking to him. We were in the club having a good time.
For police, it means the case has now become a murder investigation.
Edna Conte was arrested on federal gun charges. When it came to the homicide, we discuss tactics and how to move forward and what the next step is.
Detectives investigating the murder of 23-year-old Saquon Hall have little to go on. So far, their best leads are the two guns found near the scene. Since the weapons weren't used in the shooting, police theorize Saquon was the one carrying them. He just didn't get a chance to shoot back.
In any homicide case, the question of motive is something that we think about. There was some indication that it could have been an ambush.
A background check reveals Saquon has a history of getting into trouble. He's been in jail on several different charges, and his name pops up in connection with another homicide.
Pierre Clark was killed about a month before Saquon was killed.
Pierre was very well liked in the community. He had a lot of friends. You know, he was a fixture there.
A lot of people that knew Pierre Clark said that he was a snappy dresser. He always was paying attention to how he looked. And the people in his family said that beyond this big showboat, beyond this big showy personality, Pierre Clark was somebody that really cared for his family.
Like Saquon, 28-year-old Pierre Clark was also trying to overcome a checkered past.
He had had some substance abuse issues, and he was just one of those folks that he was known to the police because of this, but he would kind of float in and out of the legal system.
He'd been going to treatment and recovering from that and had a lot of hopes and dreams to kind of turn his life around and make things better, not just for him, but for his family.
But on the morning of June 8, 2016, Pierre was gunned down outside a public housing complex.
A lot of shootings tend to happen, in the mornings or in the evenings. This one was unusual because it happened in broad daylight.
I was already assigned to Pierre's homicide, but at that point, nobody had been arrested or charged.
Within a few days, however, a familiar name emerged.
It's on the police, the detectives, to do the investigation and to get the evidence necessary. But Saquon was the primary suspect in Pierre's murder.
There was video of Saquon leaving the area. I had informants telling me that he was responsible for it, informants that would testify, informants that would not testify.
Yet his loved ones insisted he was innocent of the shooting of Pierre.
I called him, I'm like, Saquon, like, where are you? Like, what's going on? Like, I'm at work, I'm here, like, hearing things that you might have did something. He's like, oh, I'm with Takia and the kids, we're at Funland. And I'm like, okay. Like, whew, there's no way Saquon could have did it. Funland's like an hour and a half away from here.
Investigators still needed to talk to him, however, not just to question him about Pierre Clark's murder, but to protect him, too.
I remember telling Patrice, look, they are saying Saquon did this homicide. They're saying Saquon killed Pierre Clark. We need to find Saquon before somebody else does. Even with the people that would talk, there were a lot of people that wouldn't. They want to handle it themselves. They wanted street justice.
Saquon's mother ultimately convinced him to participate in the investigation. But his answers to detectives' questions only increased their suspicions.
He was showing me his cell phone saying I wasn't there, and I grabbed his cell phone and did search warrant. He had said that he was going to see his mom, who worked at a community center in the area, and that didn't match up with the story.
Saquon had told his mother he was at an amusement park at the time of the shooting, not at the community center. The inconsistencies make police even more suspicious.
So I was building the case against Saquon. He was the only suspect.
But before charges could be brought against Saquon, he was murdered. To detectives investigating Saquon's death, the shooting looks like payback for the shooting of Pierre Clark. But Saquon's family still believes he is innocent.
Another mother that I'm close with, she calls me and she said, Miss Patrice, she said, I need to tell you something. And I said, what is it, sweetie? This friend tells me that she witnessed the murder of Pierre. She said, Miss Patrice, it was not your son. She said, because the guy that I saw shoot him was tall. And she also said that he had, there was another guy with him.
In the wake of her son Saquon's death, Patrice Hall turns her outrage into activism.
The murder of Pierre Clark was the third murder that year in that same area. There were a few community meetings that the police hosted in the nearby community center where she and several other mothers in the community were very much involved in trying to get this to stop. At some of those meetings, you had neighbors who were shouting, why can't you fix this? Why is this continuing to happen?
Saquon's loved ones might believe he wasn't involved, but investigators think he may have made some dangerous enemies. Rumor has it that two of these enemies were brothers, Pierre and DeJuan Clark.
Apparently, Saquon's friend had beef with the Clarks. Well, both of them, actually.
Saquon, who was always known to have his friends back, might have joined his friend's ongoing feud with the Clark brothers.
Saquon was somebody who took things very personally. He had a sense of honor about him. If something bad was happening to people around him, Saquon was always the first one to step up and take responsibility for that, to try to fix it.
Saquon's family say his idea of payback wasn't violent like shooting, but it could still have been hurtful to DeJuan.
Saquon decided to, start dating or messing with his child's mom. It made it a little awkward, and it made it more so up on a personal level.
My grandmother used to always say, you try to dig a ditch for someone else that you're gonna fall in.
Many believe this personal slight, dating DeJuan's ex, is what led to Saquon's first shooting in June 2015, though Saquon seemed to try to cover for whoever shot him that time.
Saquon was saying, it's self-wound. I did it myself. I had a gun on me, and I put it in my pocket, and I shot myself in the thigh. Although the police can definitely tell that wasn't like a self-inflicted wound.
Everybody knew that there was something going on between Pierre and Saquon.
Many suspected Pierre shot Saquon, though he was never charged in that shooting. But a short time later, both men crossed paths again while in jail for other crimes.
Out of nowhere, Saquon's in the detention center with Pierre. I really don't understand why they would put them on the same unit in the same jail where they could see each other on a daily basis and talk to one another. I heard Pierre told Saquon he wanted to kill him and that whenever they get out, it's basically, whenever I see you, I'm just gonna handle the situation.
Instead, after the two were released, Pierre was the one who was gunned down. first, it seemed Pierre's brother Dewan decided to let the feud die with him.
Dewan very much called for peace in the aftermath of Pierre's murder. And you very much got this sense that Dewan Clark was very publicly trying to help the family and trying to steer them through this, trying to keep them from retaliating, to hold the family together in the wake of an unimaginable tragedy. But at the same time, I think Dewan Clark was also really struggling with issues of rage. How do you walk down the street? How do you walk past the site where your brother was murdered and not let that affect you? How do you move on from something that is in your face every single day, especially for something that was at the time an unsolved murder?
Did Dewan's anger finally get the better of him?
This really reeked of revenge, and you can just see things fall into place. And you better believe people are talking.
Days after the murder of Saquon Hall, detectives have zeroed in on a suspect, 30-year-old Dewan Clark.
Dewan Clark's brother, Pierre Clark, had been murdered less than a month prior to Saquon's death. The primary suspect in that case was Saquon Hall. So our belief was that Dewan Clark murdered Saquon Hall as an act of revenge for Saquon murdering his brother.
So far, none of the eyewitnesses have been willing to identify Dewan as the shooter. But the many stories about the bad blood between the two men make it hard for investigators to believe no one recognized Dewan.
When you start hearing a run and gun battle, you were going to get people looking out their window, see what's going on. And they had just come back from the club, so there were other people milling around. It was not just Saquon and Dewan out there. There were other people out there.
There was a significant amount of witness intimidation that was aimed at them, and they were very scared to come to court. So a big part of our job was to try to counteract that, to put them at ease.
Within a week, detectives convinced one of the people involved to come forward.
The individual who drove Dewan from the scene was ultimately located by law enforcement and provided that information to law enforcement.
According to the eyewitnesses, it started with Dewan finding out Saquon was in the neighborhood.
The early morning hours of July 2nd, everybody was kind of coming back from the club. Saquon found himself around the area of First Street. Problem is, Dewan also found him there.
To draw Saquon out, Dewan apparently issued a challenge.
My brother got a phone call saying like, oh, Wani's over here and he's faking, or faking meaning like telling him come out, like, you know, basically looking for my brother or whatever. And my brother, although he was little and very skinny, he had like no fear in his heart. Like he was trying to fight the biggest sumo wrestler he could find. He would step out there.
Saquon left the party at his friend's house looking for Dewan. But Dewan was already lying in wait.
They went around the corner, and then Wani just started shooting at him. But he started to run, and once he got shot in the back and he, you know, hit the ground at the end of the sign, you know, Dewan came up and finished him, shot him in the head, and walked down the sidewalk, right past the car that the young ladies were sitting in.
And he did this motion to them as he walked past, as if to suggest, shh, right?
When investigators questioned the two young women who were with Saquon again, they confirmed the story.
They did not know him. He wasn't known to them. They did identify him in photo lineups to the police later. And it was through that we were able to identify Dewan Clark as the shooter. After a warrant was issued for Dewan Clark's arrest, the next step, of course, is that law enforcement had to find him and arrest him.
But Dewan has already left the state.
We interviewed as many people as we could find that had contact with Dewan.
They couldn't find him. It was like, y'all taking a long time to find somebody that really doesn't have too many resources. I didn't want it to be like my brother ever died for no reason. I did hear that he had probably went to North Carolina.
Kentree shares this lead with investigators who immediately act on it.
We utilized the U.S. Marshals Task Force to track him down and find him. The Marshals Task Force is comprised of local jurisdictions that come together and they look for people. That's what they do. They're very good at it.
On July 21st, 2016, U.S. Marshals finally get a tip on Dewan's whereabouts.
He was found in North Carolina. He went down there, I want to say, with a cousin. He showed up unannounced at a family member's home with a black trash bag full of his stuff, wanting to stay there.
So the detectives, Detective Gill and Detective Oakley, went to North Carolina to get Dewan.
Nearly 3 weeks after the murder of Saquon Hall, investigators traveled to North Carolina to arrest his suspected killer, Dewan Clark. They also want to talk to the family members Dewan had contacted there.
Part of it is you want to retrace somebody's steps. Somebody shows up at your house with a black trash bag full of their stuff saying, I want to stay. What's the first thing you're going to say? What happened? Why are you here? And so as detectives, we want to put all that together. You could find somebody that he confessed to. You could find somebody who has a little more information.
To their surprise, detectives find Dewan lounging by the pool.
He's living his best life. He was trying to figure out who said that he was there, if anybody. So in his head, he's trying to put things together.
While Dewan is taken to jail to await extradition back to Virginia, detectives search the house.
Now, bear in mind, Dewan was arrested in the swimming pool. He didn't have any of his personal items. They were all still in that house, in the bag, and in the room where he was staying. So there are pieces of this that come together with the contents of the bag.
One of the key pieces of evidence is Dewan's phone.
Cell site location data put Dewan Clark in that area at the date and time of the homicide. In addition, further cell phone evidence showed that Dewan had received a text message within minutes of the homicide, which said, "Got him." That was from a known associate of Dewan's, who may also have been in the area that night.
It was sent right after the murder, which leads to more witnesses and more information in this investigation.
Dewan denies any involvement in Saquon's shooting. But by the time police get him back to Virginia, he changed his tune.
I remember at the jail pulling him out of a cruiser. He wanted cigarettes. He wanted to smoke. And Dewan, as he smoked, would talk. And I remember sitting outside of the jail having about a 30-minute conversation with him.
He expressed some sorrow, some regret. This was very much a heat of the moment. This was an anger that had sat in him, and I don't think it brought him any relief.
Dewan stops short of confessing to the murder of Saquon Hall. But he does admit to blaming Saquon for his brother's death.
After the murder of Pierre Clark, Dewan would go down to the location where Pierre was killed. And there was a memorial set up at a tree right there. and he didn't go to work and was spiraling, and the murder of his brother was weighing heavy on him. Saquon Hall was allegedly talking about having killed Pierre Clark. It just got too much for DeJuan to handle. He wanted to make a deal, but as detectives, we're not in a position to make a deal. That's something that only the Commonwealth's attorney can do, state's attorneys in some jurisdictions. In Virginia, it's a Commonwealth's attorney. That is our guy, Sean Sherlock.
DeJuan expressed some remorse about the situation, but he never admitted that he's the one that killed Saquon. So in considering then, as a prosecutor, how we were going to present the case in court, the question was, all right, what's the evidence here?
Prosecutors feel confident they have a strong enough case against DeJuan to avoid making a deal. On September 26, 2016, they present their evidence in a preliminary hearing.
That's the first court date where DeJuan's in court, we're in court, and we have to present evidence to a judge. And these witnesses, the two eyewitnesses in that car, were subpoenaed for court that day, and they were going to have to testify. Because of the witness intimidation that had been going on and their fear of reprisals here for cooperating with the investigation, they were very scared about being in that place. We ultimately brought them into the court through a side door.
Despite their fear, the two women provide a detailed account of the shooting.
When one of the eyewitnesses testified, I got to that point in her testimony where she was required to identify the person whom she was talking about having seen shoot Saquon in open court. And initially, she couldn't even make eye contact. She couldn't even look at him. She was too scared. And I remember I had to walk a little closer to her and ask her to look around that room and tell the judge if she saw that person here today. And she very bravely at that point did, and then unequivocally identified DeJuan Clark as the shooter.
After the hearing, instead of taking his chances with a jury, DeJuan Clark pleads guilty to second-degree murder.
On July 27th of 2017, DeJuan Clark was sentenced to 43 years. 12 of those 43 years were suspended to do a 31-year stint in prison, and he was also ordered to pay $5,000 towards the funeral costs for Saquon Hall. The Commonwealth of Virginia, there is no early parole in Virginia, and so DeJuan Clark will be in prison for the entirety of those 31 years.
31 years that is a large chunk of somebody's life, and that is 31 years for a rash, heat of the moment decision that will haunt him even after those 31 years are over.
As a detective, you know these people and you see the struggles and you see the successes. And you, as a detective, you want to celebrate the successes and help with the struggle. And when you see a young life like Pierre Clark or Saquon Hall taken for senseless reasons, this street justice and thug life and all this stuff just ends up in people dead.
I feel like second degree wasn't enough. I just feel like my brother's gone. A life is gone. He's never coming back. So in a sense, I feel life for life. So if you took his life, I feel like you should spend the rest of yours behind bars. But I mean, I know eventually one day when I'm about 50 or so, he'll be home. And then I just will have to prepare myself for that.
I can't say that I wanted more time for him. I mean, I did feel like that in the beginning.
For nearly a year, something invisible seemed to move through the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. It did not arrive with shattered windows or screaming alarms. It did not announce itself in ways people usually imagine when they picture tragedy. Instead, it arrived quietly, hidden behind fluorescent lights that never turned off, behind the soft mechanical rhythm of ventilators, behind the careful routines of nurses and doctors who dedicated their lives to keeping the smallest patients alive. In a place where every heartbeat mattered and every gram of weight could mean the difference between survival and loss, death began appearing with a frequency that no one could comfortably explain. One baby deteriorated without warning. Then another. Some had been showing encouraging signs only hours earlier. Parents who had spent the day believing their child was finally turning a corner suddenly found themselves standing in silent hospital corridors, struggling to understand how hope could disappear so quickly. The questions came long before the answers. Was it infection? Was it an unfortunate coincidence? Had the unit simply admitted more critically ill infants than usual? Or was something far darker unfolding inside one of the safest places in any hospital? Those questions would eventually lead investigators down a path that would transform a respected neonatal nurse into one of the most controversial figures in modern British criminal history. Even today, years after the verdict, those same questions continue to echo beyond the courtroom. Because while the legal system reached its conclusion, the debate surrounding some of the evidence has never truly disappeared. This is the story of Lucy Letby, a story that forces us to confront not only allegations of unimaginable crimes, but also the limits of certainty when medicine, law, statistics, and human tragedy collide. Hospitals have a language of their own. During the day, conversations overlap with the steady movement of staff rushing from room to room. At night, the atmosphere changes. Corridors become quieter. Footsteps seem louder against polished floors. Monitors pulse steadily in darkened rooms where parents sit beside incubators, measuring time not in hours but in breaths, oxygen levels, and hopeful glances exchanged with exhausted doctors. In a neonatal intensive care unit, every patient has entered the world earlier than expected or under circumstances that demand extraordinary care. Many weigh less than a bag of sugar. Their skin appears almost translucent beneath the glow of medical equipment. Tiny fingers curl instinctively around an adult's fingertip, reminding everyone present that despite the tubes, the wires, and the machines, these are simply babies whose lives have barely begun. The staff who work in such environments become accustomed to living between optimism and heartbreak. They celebrate victories that might seem impossibly small to outsiders. A baby who tolerates a feeding. A successful reduction in oxygen support. A stable heart rate maintained throughout the night. Every improvement is carefully documented because every improvement matters. Yet they also know that medicine has limits. Premature birth carries risks that cannot always be overcome, no matter how experienced the clinicians or how advanced the equipment. Loss, while deeply painful, is an accepted possibility. It is never welcomed, but it is understood. That understanding becomes far more fragile when patterns begin to emerge. In 2015, staff members at the Countess of Chester Hospital noticed something unsettling. Babies were collapsing unexpectedly. Some recovered after frantic efforts by doctors and nurses. Others did not. Several cases appeared unusual enough that experienced consultants struggled to explain them using the complications they encountered in everyday neonatal practice. Each individual event could perhaps be rationalized. Medicine is filled with unpredictable outcomes. Premature infants can deteriorate suddenly. Rare complications happen. But when similar questions continued appearing over successive months, concern slowly replaced reassurance. No one immediately suspected murder. That fact is important. Real investigations rarely begin with certainty. They begin with confusion. Doctors first searched for medical explanations. They reviewed treatment decisions. They considered infections. They questioned whether staffing shortages might have affected patient care. They examined whether changes in admission patterns meant the hospital was receiving babies with increasingly complex medical needs. Every possibility deserved consideration because the consequences of reaching the wrong conclusion would be enormous. As months passed, however, one observation refused to disappear. A particular nurse appeared to be present during many of the unexpected collapses. On its own, that observation proved nothing. Hospitals operate through shift schedules. Nurses assigned to intensive care naturally spend significant time with the sickest patients. Coincidences happen. Statistical clusters occur. Any experienced investigator understands that patterns must be tested rather than assumed. Yet once a possible pattern has been identified, it becomes impossible to ignore. That nurse was Lucy Letby. At the time, few people outside the hospital had ever heard her name. She was regarded by colleagues as a dedicated neonatal nurse. She had trained for years to care for premature infants. She participated in professional development. She exchanged ordinary messages with co-workers. Friends described someone whose life appeared remarkably conventional. Social media photographs showed birthday celebrations, holidays, smiling faces gathered around restaurant tables. Nothing in those images suggested the extraordinary accusations that would later dominate newspaper headlines across Britain and beyond. When police eventually became involved, the investigation they launched would receive the name Operation Hummingbird. Detectives faced an almost unprecedented challenge. There was no obvious crime scene preserved behind police tape. No eyewitness describing an attack. No surveillance footage capturing criminal acts. Instead, investigators found themselves navigating thousands upon thousands of pages of medical records, laboratory reports, medication charts, staffing rotas, digital communications, and expert clinical opinions. Every document represented another attempt to understand events that had unfolded inside one of the most medically complex environments imaginable. The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the picture became. Prosecutors would ultimately argue that multiple babies had been deliberately harmed using different methods, including the introduction of air into the bloodstream, the administration of insulin that had not been prescribed, excessive feeding through nasogastric tubes, and interference with breathing support. The defense would reject those allegations, arguing that the hospital itself faced significant systemic problems, that premature babies often experience unpredictable medical crises, that staffing pressures existed, and that the prosecution's interpretation of complex medical evidence was flawed. Those competing narratives would eventually confront one another inside a courtroom. But before the courtroom came the families. Behind every case number was a child whose life had barely begun. Behind every medical chart stood parents who had already endured one of the most frightening experiences imaginable, watching their newborn fight for survival. Many had celebrated encouraging updates before receiving devastating news. Some remembered leaving the hospital briefly to rest, believing their baby was stable enough for a short absence, only to receive urgent calls summoning them back. Others described being surrounded by teams of clinicians performing desperate resuscitation attempts while they searched faces for reassurance that never came. The legal proceedings would later refer to these infants using letters rather than names to protect their identities. That anonymity serves an important purpose. It reminds us that this story is not about public spectacle. It is about children who never chose to become part of one of the most closely scrutinized criminal cases in recent British history. As investigators reconstructed timelines, another aspect of the case attracted enormous attention. During searches of Lucy Letby's home, police recovered handwritten notes containing deeply troubling phrases. Among them were statements interpreted by prosecutors as admissions of guilt. The defense argued something entirely different, maintaining that the writings reflected overwhelming emotional distress experienced by a nurse who believed she had become the focus of suspicion and blame. Those handwritten pages would become one of many fiercely contested pieces of evidence presented during the trial, illustrating how even the same physical object could support radically different interpretations depending upon the broader narrative surrounding it. The trial itself would stretch across many months, exposing jurors to extraordinarily detailed medical testimony. Experts debated laboratory findings. Consultants explained neonatal physiology. Lawyers challenged statistical assumptions, clinical judgments, and timelines minute by minute. Unlike fictional crime dramas, there was no dramatic confession delivered under bright lights. There was no single piece of evidence that instantly resolved every uncertainty. Instead, the prosecution relied upon the cumulative weight of multiple strands of evidence considered together, while the defense argued that the same evidence failed to exclude reasonable alternative explanations. In August 2023, the jury convicted Lucy Letby of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. In 2024, following a retrial on one unresolved count, she was convicted of an additional count of attempted murder. Those convictions remain legally in force, and appellate courts have rejected several attempts to overturn them. At the same time, some clinicians, statisticians, scientists, legal commentators, and investigative journalists have continued publicly questioning aspects of the medical and statistical evidence used during the proceedings, calling for further independent examination. Their criticisms do not alter the legal status of the convictions, but they explain why the case continues to generate intense discussion years after the verdicts were delivered. That enduring tension is what makes this story unlike almost any other. Most criminal cases eventually settle into history. Appeals conclude. Public attention fades. The narrative becomes fixed. The Lucy Letby case has resisted that process. For some, it represents the exposure of a serial killer who betrayed the trust placed in a neonatal nurse responsible for society's most vulnerable patients. For others, it raises profound questions about how complex medical evidence should be interpreted in criminal courts and whether every conclusion reached during the investigation can withstand continuing scientific scrutiny. Between those positions stand the families, whose lives were changed forever regardless of how public debates continue to evolve. This story does not begin with certainty. It begins with fragile lives, unexplained collapses, anxious clinicians searching for answers, and a hospital where the ordinary routines of care gradually gave way to suspicion. Before detectives assembled timelines, before lawyers argued competing theories, before newspapers filled front pages with photographs and headlines, there was simply a series of devastating moments that no one inside the neonatal unit could fully explain. Those moments would become the foundation of an investigation whose consequences reached far beyond a single hospital. Forcing an entire nation to ask whether the unimaginable had happened, or whether the search for answers in an extraordinarily complex medical environment had become a story almost as complicated as the tragedies themselves. There is a reason hospitals are built to inspire confidence. Every polished corridor, every neatly labeled medication cabinet, every carefully rehearsed emergency protocol exists to reassure families that even in the worst moments of their lives, someone is in control. Nowhere is that trust more profound than inside a neonatal unit. Parents hand over children who are measured not in years, but in hours. Their babies cannot describe pain. They cannot call for help. They cannot even open their eyes for long before exhaustion overtakes them. Their survival depends almost entirely on the knowledge, judgment, and compassion of strangers wearing hospital uniforms. It is a relationship built on absolute faith. Once that faith is shaken, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to restore. By the time concerns within the Countess of Chester Hospital began attracting wider attention, no one could yet imagine how far the story would travel. The events unfolding inside a regional hospital in northwest England would eventually dominate headlines around the world, inspire countless documentaries, investigative reports, podcasts, and academic discussions, and divide experts who agreed on very little except one point. The case was unlike almost anything they had encountered before. The public often imagines criminal investigations beginning with obvious clues. A broken lock. A weapon left behind. A witness running toward the police. This investigation looked nothing like that. Instead, it unfolded through paperwork. Medical records were revisited repeatedly. Consultants compared notes written months apart. Laboratory results that had once been filed away as part of routine clinical practice were examined again under an entirely different lens. Detectives who had spent careers investigating assaults, burglaries, and homicides suddenly found themselves immersed in neonatal medicine, learning terminology that had once belonged exclusively to specialist doctors and nurses. Every abbreviation on a patient chart could matter. Every timestamp on a medication record might become significant. Every shift schedule needed to be reconstructed with painstaking accuracy. The scale of the task was immense because every conclusion carried extraordinary consequences. If the unexplained collapses reflected natural medical complications, then accusing an innocent healthcare professional would represent a devastating miscarriage of justice. If, however, the collapses resulted from deliberate harm, then identifying the responsible individual became one of the most urgent criminal investigations imaginable. Those two possibilities existed side by side for a long time. Neither could simply be assumed. As investigators worked behind the scenes, life inside the hospital continued. New babies arrived. New families entered the neonatal unit carrying the same mixture of hope and fear experienced by every parent of a premature child. Staff members continued performing resuscitations, adjusting ventilators, calculating medication dosages measured in tiny fractions, and comforting anxious mothers and fathers who searched every facial expression for reassurance. Medicine rarely allows the luxury of pausing. Patients continue arriving regardless of what investigators are trying to understand. Yet beneath those daily routines, something had changed. Questions that had once remained private conversations among consultants gradually became impossible to ignore. Why had several babies deteriorated in ways that appeared unusual? Why did some collapses resist conventional medical explanations? Why did experienced clinicians remember certain cases long after others had faded from memory? Even asking those questions carried emotional weight. Doctors are trained to challenge their own assumptions. They know that memory is imperfect. They know hindsight can create patterns that seemed invisible at the time. They understand that confirmation bias can influence even experienced professionals. That is why medicine depends upon evidence rather than instinct. The same principle applies in criminal investigations. Suspicion alone proves nothing. Patterns must be tested. Alternative explanations must be explored. Evidence must withstand scrutiny. As the inquiry expanded, detectives sought assistance from independent medical experts capable of reviewing complex neonatal cases without having participated in the original treatment. Their role was not simply to identify unusual outcomes but to evaluate whether those outcomes were consistent with recognized medical conditions or whether deliberate interference offered a more convincing explanation. These reviews would become an important component of the prosecution's case. They would also later become one of the central subjects of criticism from experts who questioned aspects of the conclusions reached. That disagreement would ultimately extend far beyond the courtroom. Statisticians examined whether apparent patterns could emerge by chance. Neonatologists debated interpretations of clinical findings. Legal scholars discussed how highly technical medical evidence should be presented to juries composed of ordinary citizens. Scientists questioned whether some conclusions rested upon sufficiently robust foundations. Others defended the investigation, arguing that no single piece of evidence stood alone and that the overall pattern remained compelling when viewed as a whole. It is precisely because these debates continue that telling this story requires care. There are facts that are firmly established. There are arguments presented by the prosecution. There are responses presented by the defense. There are expert opinions that supported the convictions. There are expert opinions that challenged parts of the evidence afterward. Understanding the case means recognizing where those categories differ rather than blending them together. That distinction matters because real lives exist behind every legal document. The families who lost children do not experience their grief as an academic debate. The clinicians who spent years defending their medical judgments do not regard the case as merely an intellectual exercise. Nor does the convicted nurse, who has consistently maintained her innocence despite the verdicts against her. Those realities coexist whether or not they comfortably fit into a simple narrative. Perhaps that is one reason the case continues to capture worldwide attention. People naturally search for certainty. We want stories with unmistakable villains, unquestionable evidence, and endings that resolve every lingering doubt. Reality is often less accommodating. Courtrooms operate according to legal standards. Science evolves as new research emerges. Medicine accepts uncertainty as an unavoidable companion. When those three worlds intersect, disagreements sometimes persist long after a verdict has been delivered. The Lucy Letby case sits precisely at that intersection. For the jury that heard months of testimony, the evidence proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt on multiple charges. For others reviewing aspects of the case afterward, questions remained about whether every medical conclusion had been interpreted correctly. Those continuing discussions have not changed the legal outcome, but they have ensured that the story remains under close public examination. As we move deeper into this case, it is worth remembering something easily forgotten amid headlines and courtroom arguments. Every infant involved was someone's entire world. Many parents had already endured difficult pregnancies before premature delivery forced them into an unfamiliar environment filled with incubators and intensive care equipment. They learned new medical vocabulary almost overnight. Oxygen saturation, bradycardia, intubation, central lines, blood gases. Terms that once belonged exclusively to healthcare professionals became part of daily conversations because understanding them offered a small sense of control during an otherwise overwhelming experience. Families celebrated tiny victories that most people never think twice about. A baby gaining a few grams. A successful feeding. A reduction in respiratory support. A peaceful night's sleep without major alarms. Inside a neonatal unit, these moments feel enormous because progress is often measured in increments almost too small to notice. That fragile optimism forms the emotional backdrop against which every unexpected collapse occurred. Each emergency interrupted not only medical treatment but also a family's growing belief that tomorrow might finally be better than today. Doctors rushed toward incubators. Parents searched faces for reassurance. Machines continued displaying numbers that suddenly mattered more than words. Some infants survived after prolonged resuscitation. Others did not. Those moments became permanently etched into memory. Years later, many details presented during the trial remained remarkably vivid because traumatic experiences often preserve ordinary images with extraordinary clarity. The position of a chair beside an incubator. A nurse entering the room. A consultant speaking quietly to colleagues. The color of evening light outside hospital windows. None of those details alone established criminal responsibility, yet together they reflected the deeply human reality behind thousands of pages of legal documents. Long before national newspapers reported the story, before television crews gathered outside court buildings, before legal commentators debated evidence in public forums, there existed only grieving families searching for explanations that medicine had not immediately provided. That search for answers gradually expanded beyond hospital walls. Consultants contacted hospital management. Concerns were documented. External authorities became involved. Eventually, police investigators assumed responsibility for determining whether unexplained medical events concealed criminal acts. Once that transition occurred, the nature of every previous event changed. Clinical decisions became potential evidence. Routine documentation became investigative material. Conversations once intended only for patient care acquired possible legal significance. The past itself seemed to shift under the weight of new questions. What had once appeared tragic might instead appear suspicious. What had seemed suspicious might ultimately prove medically explainable. Distinguishing between those possibilities required years of investigation. It also required extraordinary patience. Unlike dramatic fictional detectives solving crimes within 48 hours, investigators in this case spent years assembling evidence before charges were filed. That slow pace reflected caution rather than indecision. Every allegation involved the deaths or serious collapses of newborn infants. Every conclusion needed to withstand the scrutiny of defense lawyers, independent experts, appellate judges, and public examination. Even then, the story would remain unfinished. Because once the verdicts were delivered, another chapter began, not inside hospital wards or police interview rooms, but within scientific journals, professional conferences, investigative reporting, and ongoing public discussion about the interpretation of evidence itself. That continuing debate should not obscure one fundamental truth. Whatever position someone ultimately takes regarding the contested aspects of the case, nothing can erase the suffering experienced by the families whose children became part of this investigation. Their loss is not theoretical. Their memories are not statistical arguments. They are the human foundation beneath every legal submission, every expert report, and every headline written since. And it is there, before the courtroom, before the controversy, before the world learned the name Lucy Letby, that this story truly begins, with vulnerable newborns fighting for life, parents holding on to hope 1 hour at a time. And a neonatal unit where a series of devastating events slowly transformed routine medical uncertainty into one of the most consequential and intensely debated criminal investigations in modern British history. The story you are about to hear has been examined from almost every possible angle. Police investigators spent years assembling evidence. Prosecutors constructed a case they argued revealed a deliberate pattern of harm. Defense lawyers challenged nearly every major conclusion, insisting that complex medicine had been mistaken for criminal intent. A jury listened to months of testimony before reaching guilty verdicts. Appeal courts later upheld those convictions. Yet outside the courtroom, some clinicians, statisticians, scientists, and legal commentators continued to question aspects of the medical and statistical evidence, arguing that further independent review remained necessary. These two realities now exist side by side. Legally, Lucy Letby stands convicted of multiple murders and attempted murders, and those convictions remain in force. Publicly and academically, debate over parts of the evidence continues. Understanding this case means holding both facts in mind without allowing either to erase the other. Perhaps that is what makes this story so deeply unsettling. It is not simply a story about crime. It is a story about trust. Trust in medicine. Trust in institutions. Trust in science. Trust in the justice system. Each of those forms of trust is built slowly over decades, but each can be shaken by a single extraordinary case. When people walk into a hospital, they rarely think about the countless invisible decisions being made every minute. They assume that every syringe, every medication, every adjustment to a ventilator is performed with one purpose alone: preserving life. That assumption is so deeply rooted that most of us never even recognize it exists until something challenges it. The Countess of Chester Hospital was not a place known around the world before these events. It was a district general hospital serving families across Cheshire and the surrounding region. To local parents, it represented reassurance. Children were born there. Operations were performed there. Lives were saved there every single day. The neonatal unit was one small part of a much larger institution, staffed by professionals who had chosen one of the most emotionally demanding specialties in healthcare. They worked long shifts that blurred into nights, weekends, and holidays. They missed family dinners, birthdays, and sleep because premature babies do not recognize calendars. Illness follows no schedule. Those who dedicate their careers to neonatal care often develop a remarkable combination of precision and compassion. They must remain calm while making decisions measured in seconds. They must comfort terrified parents even as they perform technically complex procedures. They celebrate quietly because they know every victory remains fragile. They grieve privately because another family may need them only moments later. It is a profession sustained by resilience more than recognition. Against that backdrop, the allegations that would eventually emerge seemed almost impossible to comprehend. How could someone trained to protect newborn lives instead be accused of deliberately ending them? It is a question that naturally dominates public attention. Yet it is also a question that can unintentionally overshadow another equally important one. How did experienced clinicians first realize something might be wrong? The answer was not dramatic. There was no single catastrophic night when alarms suddenly revealed an obvious culprit. There was no eyewitness describing criminal behavior. Instead, suspicion developed gradually, almost reluctantly. Doctors noticed unusual collapses. Consultants compared memories of difficult cases. Outcomes that initially appeared isolated slowly began resembling one another in ways they struggled to explain. The process was incremental, driven less by certainty than by persistent unease. Anyone who has worked inside a hospital understands how dangerous assumptions can be. Every unexpected death demands reflection. Every serious complication is reviewed. Medicine advances because clinicians continuously examine their own decisions, asking whether different choices might have produced different outcomes. That culture of self-examination meant the first questions were directed inward rather than outward. Could treatment protocols be improved? Had infections spread unnoticed? Were staffing pressures affecting patient safety? Was the unit admitting increasingly vulnerable infants? These possibilities deserved careful investigation because each represented a plausible explanation. Hospitals around the world confront resource limitations. Premature babies remain among the most medically fragile patients in any healthcare system. Even under ideal conditions, tragedy cannot always be prevented. Only after those explanations failed to satisfy some of the consultants involved did attention begin shifting toward whether the collapses shared another common factor. The eventual identification of Lucy Letby as a recurring presence during multiple incidents became one component of a much broader investigative picture. It was never presented by prosecutors as the sole basis for criminal responsibility, nor did the defense accept that it established anything meaningful. The prosecution argued that the timing supported a wider pattern when considered alongside medical evidence and other material recovered during the investigation. The defense argued that staffing patterns, workload, and retrospective interpretation could create misleading impressions of association. Those competing perspectives would define much of the trial. By the time the case reached court, it had evolved far beyond individual medical emergencies. It had become an intricate reconstruction of hundreds of shifts, dozens of clinical events, thousands of documents, and years of professional decision-making. Jurors were asked to evaluate evidence unlike that presented in most criminal cases. Instead of DNA profiles or surveillance footage, they encountered expert testimony explaining neonatal physiology, insulin testing, air embolism, resuscitation practices, and detailed timelines assembled from medical records. Listening to such evidence required extraordinary concentration. Understanding it required patience. Judging it required balancing competing expert opinions while remembering that behind every technical discussion stood a child whose life had been forever altered. That human reality should never be forgotten. It is easy, especially after years of headlines, to reduce the case to legal arguments and scientific disputes. Yet every exhibit shown in court corresponded to a real family. Every medical chart represented parents who had once waited anxiously beside an incubator. Every timeline marked moments that forever divided lives into a before and an after. For those families, there would never be a return to ordinary life. Some left the hospital carrying empty car seats that had been installed only days earlier with excitement and hope. Others returned home to nurseries that would never be used in the way they had imagined. Photographs intended to celebrate milestones instead became treasured reminders of painfully brief lives. Birthdays became anniversaries of grief. Questions without easy answers lingered long after hospital corridors disappeared from view. No courtroom verdict, regardless of its outcome, could restore what had been lost. As the legal process unfolded, the wider public searched for meaning. News reports often focused on dramatic details because dramatic details attract attention. Handwritten notes found during police searches became front-page stories. Court testimony describing medical emergencies generated intense public reaction. Yet the complete picture remained far more complex than any single headline could capture. Trials compress years of investigation into narratives designed for jurors. Newspapers compress months of testimony into articles that readers can finish in minutes. Podcasts, documentaries, and television programs each make their own editorial decisions about emphasis and pacing. This series aims to do something different. Not by inventing details where none exist. Not by choosing certainty where genuine debate remains. But by slowing down enough to understand how an ordinary hospital became the center of one of the most consequential criminal cases in recent British history. Because stories like this are not built from isolated dramatic moments. They are built from accumulation. One unexplained collapse. Another difficult conversation. Another review meeting. Another document. Another question that refuses to disappear. Eventually, those questions became impossible to contain within the walls of a single hospital. They expanded into a police investigation of unprecedented scale, a criminal trial lasting many months, convictions that reshaped public confidence in neonatal care, and continuing scientific discussions that ensure the case remains part of ongoing legal and medical conversation even today. As we move beyond this introduction, remember where everything truly began. Not with detectives. Not with courtrooms. Not with headlines. It began in a neonatal intensive care unit where the smallest patients fought battles they could never understand, where parents placed absolute trust in the professionals surrounding their children. And where a sequence of devastating events slowly transformed routine medical uncertainty into a case that continues to challenge assumptions about evidence, accountability, and the difficult search for truth. In the next chapter, we step back from the investigation itself and travel to the beginning, exploring the world before suspicion took hold, the hospital, the people who worked within it, and the quiet routines that made what happened afterwards so profoundly difficult to comprehend. Before investigators assigned operation names to the case, before court artists sketched weeks of testimony, before headlines carried a nurse's face across front pages around the world, the Countess of Chester Hospital was simply another hospital beginning another ordinary day. Morning arrived the way it always did. Cars rolled slowly into the staff parking lot while the sky over Cheshire shifted from grey to pale blue. Commuters carried steaming coffee cups through automatic doors. Night shift nurses exchanged brief smiles with colleagues arriving to replace them. Somewhere in the distance, a porter pushed an empty trolley along polished corridors, its wheels creating a familiar rhythm that blended into the background noise of a building that never truly slept. The hospital existed in a constant state of quiet motion. Patients were admitted. Blood samples were collected. Operating theaters prepared for scheduled procedures. Phones rang, elevators opened and closed, and lives changed every hour without attracting the attention of anyone beyond the people living those moments. Hospitals occupy a unique place in society. Few buildings witness more hope and more heartbreak under the same roof. One family celebrates the birth of a healthy child while another receives devastating news from a consultant only a few corridors away. Relief and grief exist side by side, separated by little more than a set of double doors. Doctors and nurses learn to navigate those emotional extremes because they have no alternative. They cannot allow yesterday's tragedy to interfere with today's patient. They cannot celebrate one success for too long because another emergency may already be unfolding nearby. The work demands constant focus, and nowhere is that demand greater than inside a neonatal unit. Hidden away from the busiest public corridors, behind secure doors that required authorized access, the neonatal unit functioned almost like a world of its own. Parents entered after washing their hands with meticulous care, often removing jewelry and following infection control procedures they had never imagined needing to learn. Inside, the lighting remained soft enough to protect fragile eyes, yet bright enough for staff to perform delicate procedures. Transparent incubators stood in carefully arranged rows, each surrounding a child whose first days of life looked nothing like the joyful scenes most families expect when welcoming a newborn. Many of the babies cared for had arrived weeks, sometimes months, before their due dates. Others had experienced difficult deliveries or medical complications that demanded immediate specialist attention. Some weighed barely more than a kilogram. Their skin appeared almost translucent beneath the glow of monitoring equipment. Tiny adhesive sensors covered their chests, tracking every heartbeat. Fine tubes delivered nutrition, medication, or breathing support. The machinery surrounding them could appear intimidating to visitors, but to nurses and doctors it formed the language of survival. Every monitor displayed information that might signal improvement, deterioration, or the need for immediate intervention. Parents learned that language remarkably quickly. Within days, many could recognize the difference between a routine alarm and one that demanded urgent attention. They learned which numbers represented oxygen saturation, which indicated heart rate, and why nurses sometimes adjusted ventilator settings several times within an hour. They became experts not because they wanted to, but because loving a critically ill newborn left them little choice. Conversations that once revolved around nursery decorations and baby names shifted toward blood gas results, feeding tolerance, and whether today's chest X-ray looked more encouraging than yesterday's. Time behaved differently inside the neonatal unit. Outside the hospital, weeks passed almost unnoticed. Inside, every hour carried enormous significance. A baby remaining stable throughout the night could represent a major achievement. Successfully tolerating a slightly larger milk feed might be celebrated by the entire clinical team. A reduction in oxygen support by the smallest measurable amount could fill exhausted parents with cautious optimism. Progress came slowly, often frustratingly so, yet every improvement reminded families why hope remained worth holding on to. The professionals working there understood this emotional landscape better than anyone. Neonatal nursing demands technical precision combined with extraordinary emotional resilience. A single medication calculation might involve tiny fractions of a milliliter, leaving no room for error. Intravenous lines had to be inserted into veins scarcely visible beneath delicate skin. Temperature changes measured in fractions of a degree required careful monitoring. Staff documented almost everything, from feeding volumes to respiratory rates, because seemingly minor details could influence critical clinical decisions later in the day. Yet technical ability alone was never enough. Parents remembered the nurses who explained complicated procedures in simple language. They remembered the clinician who quietly reassured them after an especially frightening night. They remembered someone placing a chair beside an incubator without being asked, understanding that a mother or father might be too exhausted to remain standing any longer. These gestures rarely appeared in medical records, yet they shaped how families experienced some of the most difficult days of their lives. Among the nursing staff was Lucy Letby. Before her name became internationally recognized, she was known primarily within the hospital as a neonatal nurse who had trained specifically to care for premature and critically ill infants. Like many healthcare professionals, she had invested years in education before assuming responsibilities that required constant vigilance. Neonatal nursing is not a profession people stumble into accidentally. It attracts individuals willing to accept physically demanding shifts, emotionally difficult outcomes, and the relentless pressure of caring for patients who cannot communicate discomfort except through changes in breathing, heart rate, or movement. To colleagues, daily life with Letby appeared outwardly routine. She participated in shift handovers, reviewed patient notes, prepared medications, monitored incubators, and communicated with doctors regarding changes in babies' conditions. Staff exchanged ordinary workplace conversations about schedules, holidays, and weekend plans. Birthdays were celebrated in staff rooms. Farewell cards circulated when colleagues transferred departments or accepted positions elsewhere. Like countless workplaces across Britain, professional responsibilities existed alongside friendships formed through shared experiences and long hours. Nothing about those routines hinted at the extraordinary scrutiny that would later be directed toward nearly every aspect of the unit's operation. The Countess of Chester Hospital itself was not among Britain's largest teaching hospitals. It served its local community, referring particularly complex cases to larger specialist centres when necessary while providing essential care for thousands of patients each year. Within the neonatal service, staff balanced limited resources against the unpredictable realities of premature birth. Some days passed quietly. Others brought multiple emergencies within hours of one another. Flexibility was essential because newborn medicine rarely unfolded according to expectation. Experienced consultants often described neonatal care as a specialty that rewarded patients while punishing complacency. A premature infant could appear remarkably stable during morning rounds, only to deteriorate unexpectedly later that afternoon. Infection might develop rapidly despite careful treatment. Lung function could worsen without much warning. The smallest physiological changes sometimes produced dramatic consequences. Every member of the clinical team understood these realities. They were not signs of failure but reflections of the extraordinary fragility of patients whose organs had not yet fully developed. Because uncertainty formed part of everyday practice, clinicians developed habits designed to minimize risk. Shift handovers were detailed. Medication checks were repeated. Observations were documented frequently. Consultants reviewed difficult cases together. When unexpected events occurred, discussions often continued long after immediate treatment ended, not because someone was necessarily at fault but because medicine advances through constant examination of what happened and why. That culture of questioning would later become central to this story. At first, however, those questions remained purely clinical. Doctors debated diagnoses. Nurses reviewed observations. Teams considered whether different treatment approaches might benefit future patients. No one began by assuming criminal conduct. Such an assumption would have seemed almost unimaginable within an environment dedicated entirely to preserving life. For parents entering the neonatal unit for the first time, the staff represented certainty in an otherwise terrifying experience. Mothers recovering from difficult deliveries often arrived in wheelchairs, seeing their babies surrounded by equipment before they were able to hold them properly. Fathers found themselves learning how to place a hand gently through the incubator opening without disturbing delicate tubes and monitors. Many described feeling simultaneously grateful that advanced medical care existed and overwhelmed by the realization that their newborn depended upon it. Every encouraging conversation with doctors became precious. Every reassuring smile from a nurse carried enormous weight. Families naturally remembered the professionals who cared for their children because those faces became part of the emotional landscape surrounding the earliest days of parenthood. It is impossible to understand the significance of what happened later without first appreciating the extraordinary level of trust that existed inside those walls. That trust was not abstract. It was deeply personal. Parents entrusted nurses with feeding schedules, medication administration, comfort measures, and countless other responsibilities performed when families were briefly away resting or speaking with consultants. Every alarm answered promptly reinforced confidence. Every carefully explained procedure strengthened relationships between clinicians and families. The neonatal unit depended upon that trust because effective care required cooperation between exhausted parents and healthcare professionals working under constant pressure. Looking back after the investigation began, many ordinary moments acquired an entirely different significance. Shift records that once existed only for administrative purposes became investigative documents. Routine clinical notes became evidence examined repeatedly by experts. Conversations remembered imperfectly years later acquired potential legal importance. But during those early months, none of the people living those moments could know how history would reinterpret them. To them, it was simply another hospital. Another neonatal unit. Another group of professionals doing demanding work under difficult circumstances. Another collection of families praying that tomorrow would bring slightly better news than today. The atmosphere was defined not by suspicion but by determination. Every member of staff arrived believing that knowledge, experience, teamwork, and compassion offered vulnerable babies their best chance of survival. Every parent entered hoping that modern medicine could carry their child safely through the uncertain days ahead. It was a fragile partnership built on shared purpose, one that had been repeated countless times before and seemed destined to continue in much the same way. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to disturb that fragile sense of normality. Not a dramatic catastrophe that everyone immediately recognized, but a series of events that left experienced clinicians searching for explanations they could not easily find. The hospital itself had not changed. The incubators remained in the same places. The routines continued. The staff still reported for duty each morning and evening. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of neonatal care, questions had quietly begun to take root, questions that would eventually transform one ordinary hospital into the center of one of the most closely examined criminal cases in modern British history. If someone had walked through the neonatal unit during those months without any knowledge of what would later unfold, they would almost certainly have noticed nothing unusual. There were no visible signs that history was quietly taking shape. The incubators hummed softly beneath warm lights. Nurses moved between bedsides with practiced efficiency, checking intravenous lines, recording observations, adjusting blankets no larger than hand towels. Consultants discussed treatment plans in calm, measured voices. Parents sat beside their children for hours, sometimes speaking in whispers, sometimes saying nothing at all, convinced that simply being present mattered. It was a world governed by patience rather than speed, where victories arrived slowly and setbacks were accepted as part of the difficult reality of neonatal medicine. Every shift began with a handover. Night staff summarized the previous 12 hours to the colleagues taking over their patients. They spoke about oxygen requirements, feeding tolerance, blood test results, medication changes, and any unexpected events that had occurred overnight. No detail was considered too small. A slight increase in heart rate, a change in skin color, a brief episode of apnea, all of it was documented because in premature infants, tiny changes could become important very quickly. These conversations created a continuous chain of care, ensuring that every nurse understood not only the baby's current condition but also the events leading to that moment. The discipline required was extraordinary. Unlike adult medicine, where patients can describe pain or explain how they feel, newborns communicate almost entirely through physiological changes. A nurse might recognize subtle discomfort simply because a baby's breathing pattern looked slightly different from an hour earlier. A consultant might notice that a monitor displayed numbers drifting just outside the normal range. Clinical judgment often depended upon experience developed over years of observing infants whose bodies were still learning how to survive outside the womb. That experience fostered strong professional relationships. Doctors relied on nurses to identify early signs of deterioration. Nurses relied on consultants to make critical treatment decisions. Neither group could function effectively without the other. Mutual trust was not simply encouraged, it was essential. Within that environment, Lucy Letby appeared to occupy a familiar role. She worked alongside colleagues who shared similar responsibilities, caring for babies requiring intensive monitoring and specialized treatment. Her daily routine reflected the ordinary demands of neonatal nursing. She prepared medications according to prescriptions, documented observations, assisted during medical procedures, communicated with parents, and responded whenever monitors signaled that a baby's condition required immediate attention. Nothing about those tasks distinguished her from countless neonatal nurses working across Britain. Outside the hospital, her life also appeared unremarkable. She maintained friendships with colleagues. She attended social gatherings. She celebrated birthdays. She exchanged messages with friends about work, family, and everyday concerns. Photographs from that period show ordinary moments that could belong to almost anyone in their 20s and early 30s. Meals at restaurants. Holiday snapshots. Group celebrations. Smiling faces captured long before investigators, prosecutors, or journalists examined nearly every aspect of her life. It is often tempting, after extraordinary crimes become public, to search retrospectively for obvious warning signs. People ask whether someone looked suspicious, whether co-workers sensed something was wrong, whether strange behavior now appears obvious. Reality rarely unfolds that way. Human beings naturally reinterpret the past after learning shocking information. Events that once seemed insignificant begin appearing meaningful. Casual remarks acquire hidden importance. Ordinary decisions suddenly appear suspicious. Psychologists describe this tendency as hindsight bias, the powerful illusion that events were more predictable than they actually were. At the time, however, people experience life without knowledge of what comes next. That distinction is important. During the period later examined in court, colleagues were focused primarily on caring for vulnerable patients, not searching for criminal behavior among one another. Like many healthcare workers, they faced pressures extending beyond individual patients. Hospitals across the National Health Service frequently balanced staffing demands, financial constraints, and increasing clinical complexity. Rotas required constant adjustment when colleagues became ill or annual leave overlapped unexpectedly. Intensive care beds sometimes filled quickly, requiring difficult decisions about transfers to larger specialist centers. Consultants carried responsibility not only for immediate treatment but also for ensuring that limited resources were allocated safely and appropriately. Such pressures were hardly unique to one hospital. Healthcare systems around the world confront similar challenges. Most of the time, professionals adapt successfully through teamwork and experience. Sometimes, however, systemic pressures complicate efforts to understand why adverse outcomes occur. If mortality increases, is the explanation changing patient demographics? A particularly severe infection? Resource limitations? Random variation? Or something else entirely? These are not hypothetical questions. They arise whenever hospitals review unexpected outcomes. The Countess of Chester Hospital was no exception. As the months progressed, consultants became increasingly aware that several cases remained difficult to explain. Some babies experienced sudden collapses after periods of apparent stability. Others deteriorated despite treatment that clinicians believed appropriate. Individual tragedies did not necessarily imply criminal conduct. Neonatal medicine contains countless examples of unpredictable complications. Yet certain features of these cases left experienced doctors uneasy enough to continue discussing them long after routine clinical reviews had ended. Importantly, those discussions did not immediately produce agreement. Medicine rarely offers unanimous opinions in complex cases. One clinician might emphasize the inherent vulnerability of extremely premature infants. Another might question whether an unusual clinical finding deserved closer examination. Healthy disagreement forms part of responsible medical practice because challenging assumptions often improves patient care. As concerns slowly grew, senior doctors revisited previous cases in greater detail. They compared timelines, treatment records, laboratory findings, and staffing information. Looking at multiple incidents together sometimes reveals patterns impossible to recognize when examining each case in isolation. That process eventually contributed to the decision to involve hospital management more formally. Even then, the path forward remained uncertain. Hospitals are understandably cautious before suggesting that unexpected medical outcomes might involve deliberate harm. Such allegations affect not only individual reputations but also public confidence in healthcare institutions themselves. Accusing a clinician without compelling evidence risks profound injustice. Failing to investigate genuine concerns carries equally serious consequences. Balancing those responsibilities demanded careful judgment. Meetings became more frequent. Clinical reviews became more detailed. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Meanwhile, parents continued arriving at the neonatal unit completely unaware that broader concerns were developing behind administrative doors. To them, every interaction remained intensely personal. A mother recovering from surgery worried about producing enough breast milk. A father carefully photographed his newborn gripping a finger no wider than a pencil. Grandparents waited anxiously for updates, checking their phones repeatedly throughout the day. Life continued according to the emotional rhythms familiar to every family experiencing neonatal intensive care. Hope. Fear. Relief. Uncertainty. The staff shared many of those emotions. Healthcare professionals celebrate patient progress because they invest deeply in the children they treat. They remember babies who finally gain enough strength to breathe independently. They remember families returning months later with healthy toddlers to thank the team who cared for them during the earliest days of life. Those reunions remind clinicians why exhausting shifts and emotional strain remain worthwhile. Conversely, losses leave lasting impressions. Even experienced neonatal nurses acknowledge that some patients remain in their memories for years. Not because those cases were medically unusual. Simply because certain families, certain moments, certain conversations become impossible to forget. As later investigations unfolded, memories from this period assumed extraordinary importance. People searched their recollections for details overlooked at the time. Who entered which room? Who responded first? Who documented specific observations? How long had a baby appeared stable before deteriorating? Memory, however, is complicated. It strengthens around emotionally significant events while simultaneously becoming vulnerable to later information. Investigators therefore relied heavily on contemporaneous documentation rather than recollection alone. Medical records, electronic logs, staffing rotas, laboratory reports, and communication records provided objective anchors within a sea of human memory shaped by years of reflection. This painstaking reconstruction would eventually become one of the defining features of the investigation. Nothing happened quickly. Every timeline required verification. Every conclusion required supporting evidence. Every apparent coincidence demanded careful examination before investigators could determine whether it represented chance, clinical reality, or something more troubling. For those working inside the hospital, however, none of that painstaking analysis was yet visible. Their immediate priority remained exactly what it had always been: keeping babies alive, supporting frightened parents, preparing for the next emergency before it arrived. The future still felt unwritten. No one standing beside an incubator could know that routine observations entered into medical charts would one day be projected onto courtroom screens. No nurse documenting a feeding schedule imagined those notes might later be analyzed by forensic experts. No consultant discussing treatment options anticipated spending weeks giving evidence before a jury years later. History often reveals itself only in retrospect. At the time, ordinary life rarely announces that it is about to become extraordinary. The neonatal unit continued functioning according to its familiar rhythm. Shift followed shift. Days became weeks. New admissions replaced discharged patients. Some babies grew stronger and finally went home wrapped in blankets instead of surrounded by medical equipment. Others faced longer battles. Staff adapted continuously, responding to whatever challenges each new day presented. Yet beneath that appearance of normality, concern had begun spreading quietly among some senior clinicians. It was not yet certainty. It was not yet accusation. It was something far more unsettling, the growing realization that the explanations they had always trusted no longer seemed sufficient for every case they were witnessing. That realization marked the beginning of a journey that would eventually extend far beyond the walls of the Countess of Chester Hospital, drawing detectives, prosecutors, defense lawyers, medical experts, journalists, and the public into a case whose consequences are still being discussed today. As the seasons changed across Cheshire, life outside the hospital continued with reassuring predictability. Families filled local parks on warm afternoons. School children hurried home beneath skies that seemed no different from any other year. Shops closed at the end of another ordinary business day, streetlights illuminated quiet neighborhoods, and thousands of people ended each evening without giving a second thought to the neonatal unit inside the Countess of Chester Hospital. They had no reason to. Hospitals are meant to absorb crises without allowing them to spill into public view. The difficult moments remain behind closed doors, managed by professionals trained to confront situations most people never witness. Inside the neonatal unit, however, time was beginning to feel different for some members of staff. Certain cases refused to leave their minds. Experienced consultants are accustomed to losing patients. It is one of the most painful realities of neonatal medicine, but it is not an unfamiliar one. Premature birth remains medically complex despite decades of advances in technology and treatment. Even in world-class hospitals, some babies simply cannot be saved. Doctors learn to carry those losses with quiet dignity because dwelling too long on one tragedy can make it impossible to care effectively for the next child who urgently needs them. But every so often, a case lingers. Not because the outcome was tragic. Because something about it feels incomplete. A question remains unanswered. An explanation feels unsatisfying. An experienced clinician cannot quite reconcile what happened with everything they have learned over years of practice. Those lingering questions began to accumulate. Not all at once. Not dramatically. One unusual collapse. Another unexpected deterioration. Another discussion after morning rounds that lasted a little longer than usual. Another consultant quietly reviewing notes after everyone else had gone home. Individually, none of these moments transformed the atmosphere of the unit. Collectively, they slowly altered the way some senior staff viewed the months unfolding before them. That transformation did not happen because anyone wanted to believe something was wrong. Quite the opposite. Every doctor hoped there was an ordinary medical explanation waiting to be discovered. Medicine teaches humility. Conditions once considered mysterious are often explained by later research. Rare complications appear unexpectedly. Diagnostic mistakes happen despite everyone's best efforts. The first instinct of responsible clinicians is not to suspect malicious intent but to challenge their own understanding. That instinct shaped everything that followed. Cases were reviewed. Discussions continued. Medical possibilities were reconsidered. Questions were asked again from different angles. The process reflected caution rather than certainty. Eventually, concerns reached hospital management. Administrative meetings replaced informal conversations. Documentation became increasingly important. The purpose remained the same: determine whether the apparent pattern reflected coincidence, clinical complexity, or something requiring a far more serious response. No one could yet know where that process would lead. Meanwhile, the families living through those events remained focused on a far smaller world. A single incubator. A single bedside chair. A single child. For them, nothing beyond those walls mattered very much. Parents often describe neonatal intensive care as existing inside a kind of emotional tunnel. News headlines lose significance. Social plans disappear. Days become structured around visiting hours, consultations with doctors, and anxious waits for laboratory results. Sleep comes in short fragments. Meals are forgotten. Time outside the hospital feels strangely unreal because every meaningful moment occurs beside an incubator. Many parents develop routines that outsiders might find difficult to understand. Some read stories aloud even when their babies are too young to recognize words. Some sing quietly while nurses adjust monitors. Others simply sit in silence, believing their presence alone offers comfort. These moments rarely appear in official records. They leave no measurable data. Yet they represent the emotional reality surrounding every medical decision made inside the unit. The staff understood that reality well. Nurses frequently became witnesses to intensely personal moments shared between parents and children. They celebrated when families held a baby for the first time after weeks of intensive care. They comforted mothers overwhelmed by guilt for circumstances completely beyond their control. They reassured fathers struggling to appear calm despite obvious exhaustion. Neonatal medicine extends beyond physiology. It also requires protecting hope whenever possible. That hope made every unexplained setback especially painful. Doctors could explain many complications. They could describe infections. They could discuss immature lungs. They could outline the risks associated with extreme prematurity. What proved more difficult were situations that resisted straightforward explanation. Those were the cases that remained in conversations long after shifts ended. Looking back years later, it is tempting to imagine a single defining moment when everyone suddenly realized the seriousness of what might be happening. Reality was much quieter. Awareness developed gradually. Different people reached different conclusions at different times. Some remained convinced medical explanations would eventually emerge. Others became increasingly uncomfortable with that assumption. Neither perspective reflected bad faith. They reflected the uncertainty inherent in confronting events that seemed to challenge ordinary expectations. That uncertainty would later become one of the defining characteristics of the entire case. When detectives eventually inherited the investigation, they did not begin with certainty either. They inherited questions. Questions already shaped by months of clinical discussion. Questions requiring answers that medicine alone could no longer provide. Yet that chapter still lay ahead. For now, the Countess of Chester Hospital remained exactly what it had always appeared to be, a community hospital serving ordinary families through extraordinary moments. Babies continued arriving unexpectedly early. Doctors continued making difficult decisions. Nurses continued documenting observations with meticulous care. Parents continued hoping tomorrow would bring better news than today. The routines endured. The trust endured. At least on the surface. Beneath that surface, however, something fundamental had begun to shift. Confidence was giving way to caution. Familiarity was giving way to closer observation. Cases that once would have been remembered simply as heartbreaking outcomes were now being revisited with increasingly uncomfortable questions in mind. No accusations had yet been made publicly. No police officers had entered the unit. No journalists waited outside the hospital gates. The wider world remained completely unaware that the foundation of one of the most consequential criminal investigations in modern British history was quietly taking shape. It would take many more months before those questions reached detectives. Many more years before they reached a jury. And even after verdicts were delivered, they would continue reaching scientists, statisticians, legal scholars, and journalists who examined the evidence from different perspectives. But every investigation has a point before which nothing appears unusual and after which nothing can ever be viewed in quite the same way again. For the Countess of Chester Hospital, that point was approaching. The neonatal unit still looked exactly as it always had. The monitors still blinked softly in the dim light. The incubators still sheltered children whose futures depended on countless careful decisions made every hour. Nurses still walked the same corridors carrying medications and patient notes. Consultants still gathered for ward rounds, discussing treatments with the professionalism expected of them. Parents still whispered promises to babies too small to understand the words. No one could see that history was already beginning to separate these ordinary days from every day that had come before them. Because sometimes the most significant chapters of a true crime story do not begin with violence. They begin with ordinary people living ordinary lives, completely unaware that the answers they will one day search for are already hidden somewhere within the routines they have stopped noticing. And before suspicion would consume the hospital, before investigators would reconstruct every shift, every chart, and every conversation, there were the babies themselves, the children whose brief lives, fierce struggles, and deeply loved families would become the emotional heart of everything that followed. Their stories deserve to be told before the investigation ever begins, because without understanding who they were and what their families endured, it is impossible to understand why this case would leave such a profound mark not only on British criminal justice, but on medicine, public trust, and the lives of everyone drawn into its orbit. For most parents, the first chapter of their child's life begins with anticipation. They imagine decorating a nursery, debating names, installing a car seat that somehow feels too small until the day it suddenly carries the most precious person they have ever known. They picture sleepless nights at home, the first smile, the first laugh, the first unsteady steps across a living room floor. These expectations are so universal that they become almost invisible, woven quietly into the idea of parenthood itself. But for the families whose children entered the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, those expectations changed in an instant. Long before they worried about birthdays or first words, they found themselves learning how to read cardiac monitors, memorizing medical terminology they had never heard before, and measuring hope 1 hour at a time. Many of the babies later discussed during the investigation had arrived far earlier than expected. Premature birth transforms what should be an ordinary delivery into an emergency measured in seconds. Obstetricians move quickly. Midwives prepare equipment without unnecessary conversation. Neonatal specialists wait nearby, ready to intervene the moment the child enters the world. Instead of placing a newborn directly into a parent's arms, doctors may immediately assess breathing, heart rate, muscle tone, and oxygen levels. Within moments, the baby may be transferred to an incubator surrounded by equipment that most families have only seen in documentaries or medical dramas. For parents, the experience can feel surreal. The room that only minutes earlier echoed with excitement suddenly fills with unfamiliar voices using unfamiliar language. Medical decisions are made rapidly. Questions go unanswered for a few agonizing moments because saving the child's life takes precedence over explaining every procedure. Mothers recovering from difficult delivery sometimes catch only a brief glimpse of their baby before the incubator disappears through swinging doors. Fathers often find themselves following medical teams down hospital corridors while trying to absorb the reality that parenthood has begun in circumstances they never imagined. Those first hours shape everything that follows. Inside the neonatal unit, babies are cared for according to their medical needs rather than the traditions most families expect after childbirth. Some require ventilators because their lungs are too immature to breathe effectively on their own. Others receive intravenous nutrition while their digestive systems continue developing. Tiny sensors attached to delicate skin monitor heart rate, oxygen saturation, respiratory effort, and body temperature continuously. Even sleeping becomes part of medical care, with nurses adjusting positioning to reduce unnecessary stress on fragile bodies still adapting to life outside the womb. Parents quickly discover that touching their baby requires guidance. Hands must be cleaned meticulously. Movements must remain gentle. Sometimes the safest form of comfort is simply resting a hand softly against the baby's back without attempting to lift them. These moments, though limited, become profoundly meaningful. A slight movement of tiny fingers around a parent's thumb can erase hours of exhaustion. A stable set of observations displayed on a monitor can transform overwhelming fear into cautious optimism. A nurse quietly saying, "Today has been a good day," becomes a sentence remembered for years. The babies at the center of this case are identified publicly only by letters rather than names, a measure intended to protect the privacy and dignity of their families. That anonymity serves an important purpose. It reminds us that this story should never become entertainment built upon personal tragedy. These children were not headlines. They were sons and daughters whose lives were celebrated from the moment they entered the world, regardless of how brief those lives ultimately proved to be. Each family arrived carrying its own hopes. Some pregnancies had progressed normally before unexpected complications forced early delivery. Others had already involved months of uncertainty, specialist appointments, and difficult conversations about possible outcomes. No two journeys were identical. Yet once inside the neonatal unit, those differences often disappeared. Every parent watched monitors. Every parent waited anxiously for updates. Every parent learned that a single encouraging morning could be followed by a frightening evening. The emotional rhythm of neonatal care rarely follows a predictable pattern. Hope and fear exist side by side. One baby gains weight steadily enough for doctors to discuss reducing respiratory support. Another develops an unexpected complication requiring urgent intervention. Parents learn not to celebrate too confidently because they understand how quickly circumstances can change. At the same time, they refuse to surrender optimism because hope becomes one of the few things entirely within their control. Healthcare professionals recognize that balance. Experienced nurses often encourage families to participate in ordinary parenting whenever medically possible. Changing a diaper. Reading a story. Holding a tiny hand through the opening of an incubator. Taking photographs despite the surrounding equipment. These moments preserve a sense of parenthood that illness might otherwise overwhelm. They remind mothers and fathers that beyond the tubes and monitors lies the child they have already begun imagining bringing home. Photographs taken in neonatal units frequently capture remarkable contrasts. A baby no larger than an adult forearm lies surrounded by sophisticated medical equipment. Beside the incubator stands a parent smiling through obvious exhaustion. The machines dominate the background, yet the focus remains entirely on the child. Those images often become treasured family memories, documenting resilience rather than illness. For some families, progress came slowly but steadily. Doctors celebrated improved blood test results. Nurses reduced oxygen support. Feeding volumes increased. Parents allowed themselves to imagine life beyond the hospital. They discussed decorating bedrooms. They exchanged messages with relatives sharing cautiously optimistic news. Every positive development strengthened the belief that the most frightening days might finally be ending. That belief made unexpected setbacks especially devastating. One of the defining characteristics of several cases later examined in court was that some babies appeared to be progressing in ways clinicians considered encouraging before suffering sudden, unexplained collapses. The prosecution argued these events reflected deliberate harm. The defense maintained that neonatal medicine contains unpredictable complications and disputed the prosecution's interpretation of the medical evidence. Those competing positions would become central to the trial, but for the families living through those moments, legal arguments lay far in the future. What they experienced first was confusion. A nurse entering the room more quickly than usual. A monitor sounding continuously instead of briefly. Additional staff arriving without explanation. Doctors speaking urgently using clinical language difficult to understand. Parents stepping backward instinctively to allow medical teams room to work while desperately searching faces for reassurance. Time behaves strangely during medical emergencies. Seconds seem to stretch into minutes. Every movement appears unusually sharp. People remember isolated details with startling clarity while forgetting entire conversations. A consultant removing a stethoscope. The squeak of shoes across the floor. Someone quietly asking for additional equipment. These fragments often remain vivid years later because trauma preserves moments differently from ordinary memory. Many parents later described the emotional difficulty of leaving the hospital even briefly. Doctors and nurses encouraged rest because exhausted families cannot sustain endless bedside vigils. Yet stepping outside often produced overwhelming guilt. What if something happened while they were gone? What if the baby needed them? What if the next telephone call changed everything? These fears became familiar companions throughout prolonged neonatal admissions. Hospital routines gradually replaced normal daily life. Meals were eaten in cafeterias. Sleep occurred in short intervals. Conversations with friends centered almost entirely on medical updates. The future narrowed until it extended only as far as the next consultant's review or the next set of observations recorded on a monitor. Through all of this, the babies themselves remained astonishingly resilient. Premature infants possess a quiet determination that often surprises even experienced clinicians. Bodies weighing barely more than a kilogram continue fighting to breathe, grow, and adapt despite extraordinary challenges. Every gram gained represents progress. Every stable night becomes another step toward survival. Medical teams witness these struggles daily, which is why neonatal medicine combines profound emotional rewards with equally profound emotional risks. Each child represented possibility. Each family represented hope. Each bedside carried dreams extending far beyond the hospital walls. Some parents imagined first birthdays. Others imagined the first day of school. Many simply imagined taking their baby home, closing the front door, and finally beginning the ordinary family life they had expected from the beginning. None of them could know that their journeys would eventually become part of one of the most closely examined criminal cases in modern British history. They were not thinking about investigations. They were not thinking about courtrooms. They were thinking about tomorrow's blood tests. Tomorrow's feeding schedule. Tomorrow's chance that their baby might be just a little stronger than today. That quiet, determined hope is where the true emotional center of this story resides. Before accusations. Before forensic reviews. before legal arguments divided public opinion. There were families who loved their children without reservation, celebrating every tiny victory while believing that the people surrounding those incubators shared exactly the same purpose, protecting the smallest and most vulnerable lives entrusted to their care. For the parents, the neonatal unit slowly became more than a hospital ward. It became the center of their entire world. Days were no longer measured by the clock but by medical updates. Morning began when the consultant arrived for rounds. Afternoon was marked by another feeding, another blood test, another cautious conversation about progress. Night was often the hardest, because every phone call after dark carried the possibility of life-changing news. Families who had once lived ordinary routines suddenly found themselves existing inside a world where every heartbeat displayed on a monitor felt deeply personal. The first thing many parents learned was patience. Nothing happened quickly inside neonatal intensive care. A healthy newborn might double in size within a few months without anyone giving it much thought. A premature infant, however, earned every gram through remarkable determination. Nurses celebrated weight gains so small they barely registered on an ordinary kitchen scale. Doctors adjusted medications in tiny increments. Feeding volumes increased milliliter by milliliter. Progress rarely came in dramatic leaps. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, requiring families to celebrate achievements that most people outside the hospital would never even notice. Those celebrations mattered. A baby breathing independently for a little longer than yesterday. A feeding completed without complications. A stable temperature maintained throughout the night. Parents learned to treasure these moments because they represented proof that their child was fighting forward. They also learned that progress was rarely a straight line. Some mornings began with encouraging news only for the afternoon to bring unexpected concern. A slight drop in oxygen saturation. An unexplained change in heart rate. A new infection requiring antibiotics. Each setback reminded everyone that premature babies remained extraordinarily fragile, even when they appeared to be improving. The nurses understood this emotional cycle better than anyone. They had witnessed countless families arrive frightened and overwhelmed, slowly gaining confidence as they learned the rhythms of the unit. They knew which parents preferred detailed medical explanations and which simply wanted reassurance that someone was watching their child every second. They remembered fathers who tried to hide their fear behind practical questions. They recognized mothers who apologized unnecessarily for leaving the hospital long enough to sleep or eat. They understood that guilt often accompanied exhaustion, even though neither emotion reflected reality. One of the most meaningful moments in neonatal care is the first time parents are able to hold their baby properly. For many families, that opportunity does not come immediately after birth. Instead, it may arrive days or even weeks later, after doctors determine that the infant is stable enough to leave the incubator briefly. The moment is carefully planned. Monitoring leads remain attached. Nurses help position the baby safely. Parents move slowly, almost afraid that a sudden movement might somehow undo the progress their child has fought so hard to achieve. Then, for the first time, mother or father feels the warmth of the baby against their chest. Many later describe those moments as impossible to forget. The weight feels almost unreal. The child seems impossibly small. Every breath becomes precious. For a little while, the machines fade into the background, replaced by something far older than medicine itself, the quiet bond between parent and child. These experiences remind us why the babies involved in this case must always remain at the heart of the story. Public attention naturally gravitates toward investigations, trials, and controversy. Yet before any of that existed, there were families building memories under circumstances they had never expected. Some took photographs every day, hoping to document steady improvement. Others kept handwritten journals recording weight, medications, and encouraging milestones. Grandparents knitted tiny hats and blankets, waiting for the day the baby would finally come home. Relatives sent messages asking for updates several times each day. Entire families organized their lives around the progress of one tiny child. Hope became a shared responsibility. Every encouraging report spread quickly among relatives. Every setback did the same. No one imagined that years later, these deeply personal memories would become part of court proceedings discussed across the world. As the admissions continued, some babies reached important milestones. They required less respiratory support. Their feeding improved. Doctors began discussing discharge planning. Parents cautiously allowed themselves to imagine ordinary life returning. They pictured introducing the baby to siblings waiting at home. They thought about walks in the park. About family photographs without wires or monitors. About birthdays celebrated outside hospital walls. These dreams were simple. They were the dreams every new parent carries. That simplicity makes what followed all the more heartbreaking. Several of the infants later discussed during the trial experienced sudden and unexpected collapses after periods in which clinicians had considered them relatively stable or improving. The prosecution argued these events reflected deliberate acts that could not be explained by natural disease alone. The defense disputed those conclusions, maintaining that the babies remained medically vulnerable and that complex clinical events were later interpreted through the lens of hindsight. Those competing arguments became the focus of months of expert testimony. But none of that existed in the minds of the parents at the time. When an emergency began, legal theories meant nothing. Only survival mattered. Medical emergencies inside a neonatal unit unfold with astonishing speed. One moment the room feels calm. The next, additional staff appear almost instantly. Doctors move toward the incubator. Equipment is prepared. Voices become more urgent but remain controlled. Training takes over. Every person knows exactly where to stand and what to do. Parents often find themselves stepping back instinctively, watching professionals work with a speed and precision that is both reassuring and terrifying. Some remember focusing on the monitor because it was the only thing they felt capable of understanding. Others remember staring at the faces of doctors, searching desperately for signs of confidence or concern. Many later admitted they could remember almost nothing that was actually said. Shock has a way of reducing language into fragments. A few isolated words. A brief instruction. Someone saying, "We're trying." Then silence filled by imagination. For those whose children survived such emergencies, relief was often accompanied by lingering fear. Would it happen again? Had doctors identified the cause? Could anyone promise that tomorrow would be different? In neonatal medicine, certainty is a rare luxury. Doctors can explain probabilities. They can describe risks. They can recommend treatments. But they cannot eliminate uncertainty entirely. Families gradually learn to live with that uncertainty because they have no alternative. For those whose children did not survive, life divided permanently into before and after. Before the phone call. Before the emergency. Before the words no parent ever expects to hear. Everything afterward became a different life. Hospital corridors once associated with hope became places forever connected to loss. The carefully prepared nursery at home became painfully quiet. Friends struggled to find the right words and often discovered there were none. The world continued moving, but time seemed to stand still for the families left behind. It is impossible to fully measure grief. Court documents record dates, times, medical interventions, and legal findings. They cannot capture birthdays that would never be celebrated. They cannot describe the silence of an empty bedroom. They cannot record the ordinary moments that suddenly become unbearable because someone important is missing. These are losses beyond statistics. They exist outside legal arguments. They belong entirely to the families who experienced them. Years later, when the case reached trial, parents returned to those memories repeatedly. Some were asked to recall details from the most traumatic days of their lives. Others listened as experts debated medical evidence connected to children they still thought about every single day. The courtroom became another place where private grief entered public view. Yet through all the testimony, one truth remained constant. The babies were never simply case numbers. They were deeply loved children. Whether they lived only days or weeks, they left permanent marks on the lives of those who knew them. Their existence changed families forever. Their stories deserve to be remembered with dignity rather than reduced to evidence in a legal dispute. As we move forward into the events that transformed concern into crisis, it is important to carry these families with us. Every decision that followed, every investigation, every forensic review, every courtroom argument, and every public debate ultimately traces back to these tiny patients and the people who loved them without condition. They are the emotional foundation of this entire story, reminding us that beyond every headline stood a nursery waiting at home, a family dreaming about the future, and parents who entered a hospital believing they would one day carry their baby safely through its front doors. For years after the events at the Countess of Chester Hospital, the public would come to know these children through courtroom exhibits, legal documents, and single letters of the alphabet used to protect their identities. The legal process necessarily reduced deeply personal stories into evidence. Dates replaced birthdays. Timelines replaced memories. Medical charts replaced family photo albums. In court, each case was examined through laboratory results, treatment records, expert testimony, and clinical observations. But outside those files, beyond the language of medicine and law, every child had already transformed the lives of the people who loved them. There were parents who had spent months preparing for a future that suddenly arrived far earlier than expected. Some had carefully folded tiny clothes into drawers that would remain untouched while their newborn fought for survival inside an incubator. Some had painted nursery walls only to discover that their first weeks as parents would instead be spent beneath fluorescent hospital lights. Others had chosen names after long conversations filled with excitement, imagining birthdays, school photographs, family holidays, and countless ordinary moments that seemed guaranteed only a short time before. Those dreams did not disappear because of prematurity. They simply moved into the neonatal unit. Instead of imagining the first walk through a local park, parents imagined the day doctors would finally disconnect the last monitor. Instead of planning visits from relatives at home, they planned around hospital visiting hours. Instead of wondering which stroller to buy, they celebrated every successful feed and every stable night. Hope adapted to circumstance. It became smaller, more fragile, but no less powerful. For families living inside that world, the nurses and doctors caring for their children became familiar faces. Conversations repeated themselves in comforting routines. Someone explained overnight observations. Someone checked medications. Someone adjusted blankets, repositioned tiny bodies, or reassured anxious parents that asking questions was never an inconvenience. Trust deepened through repetition. It was built not in dramatic moments but through hundreds of ordinary interactions that slowly convinced families their babies were surrounded by people who cared as deeply about survival as they did. That trust would later become one of the defining emotional themes of the entire case. Because trust, once broken or questioned, is remarkably difficult to restore. Hospitals rely upon it. Patients rely upon it. Society relies upon it. Whether discussing the allegations themselves or the continuing debate over aspects of the evidence, nearly every conversation about this case eventually returns to that same foundation: trust. Trust in medical professionals. Trust in hospital systems. Trust in expert witnesses. Trust in courts. Trust that the truth, however complex, can ultimately be discovered. Those broader questions, however, remained far in the future. The parents standing beside incubators were not thinking about legal principles. They were thinking about tomorrow. Would their child tolerate another increase in feeding? Would the ventilator settings improve? Would today's blood tests finally show encouraging signs? Could they dare believe they were moving closer to going home? These hopes were remarkably ordinary. Perhaps that is why they remained so moving. Every family entering a neonatal unit wants essentially the same thing. Not perfection. Not certainty. Simply the chance to bring their child home. To introduce them to grandparents. To place them in the nursery prepared with such care. To begin the ordinary life that illness had temporarily interrupted. Some families eventually experienced that joy. Others did not. The emotional weight of this story lies not only in those different outcomes but also in the fact that no parent knew which future awaited them while they sat quietly beside an incubator. Each day began with possibility. Each evening ended with uncertainty. The children themselves never understood the extraordinary effort surrounding them. They slept. They breathed with assistance or on their own. They responded instinctively to touch, warmth, and familiar voices. Their world extended no farther than the incubator, the gentle hands lifting them carefully, and the voices that spoke to them with unwavering love. That innocence is impossible to ignore. It reminds us why this case has resonated so deeply around the world. Whatever conclusions individuals reach regarding the contested aspects of the investigation, everyone begins from the same place. Profound sympathy for vulnerable newborns and the families whose lives became forever intertwined with the events inside the neonatal unit. As years passed, many parents found themselves revisiting memories they had once hoped never to relive. Investigations required statements. Court proceedings required testimony. Medical experts analyzed events that families had experienced emotionally rather than clinically. Personal grief entered the public record. The experience of hearing strangers discuss the final hours of a child in technical language is difficult to imagine. Necessary for justice, perhaps. But undeniably painful. Every timeline presented in court represented one of the worst days of someone's life. Every exhibit corresponded to memories no family wished to revisit. Behind every page of documentation stood parents who once believed the future would unfold very differently. Their courage in participating in years of investigation and lengthy legal proceedings formed an often overlooked part of this story. Regardless of the continuing public debate surrounding aspects of the evidence, those families endured repeated examinations of deeply personal experiences while navigating grief that never fully disappears. That reality deserves recognition. It also reminds us that true crime stories carry responsibilities. The goal should never be spectacle. It should never be reducing human suffering into entertainment. The purpose of revisiting difficult cases is to understand what happened, how institutions responded, what evidence was presented, what questions remain, and what lessons might be learned without forgetting the people whose lives were permanently changed. As we leave the stories of the babies and their families, the tone of this narrative inevitably begins to change. Until now, we have remained close to the incubators, to the parents waiting through sleepless nights, and to the ordinary routines of neonatal care. Soon, those routines will be interrupted. The unexplained collapses that initially appeared isolated will begin occurring often enough to attract increasing attention. Consultants will start comparing observations more closely. Medical reviews will grow more urgent. Conversations that once centered solely on treatment will slowly expand into questions no one working in the hospital ever expected to ask. The shift will not happen overnight. It will happen gradually, almost reluctantly, Because accepting that something deeply unusual might be occurring inside a place dedicated to saving lives is one of the most difficult conclusions any healthcare professional can contemplate. For the families, those changes remained invisible. For the staff, they emerged one difficult case at a time. For investigators, they would eventually become the starting point of Operation Hummingbird. And for the world, they would become the opening chapter of one of the most consequential and closely scrutinized criminal investigations in modern British history. The babies whose stories we have just explored never had the opportunity to tell their own stories. Instead, their lives became the reason others searched for answers. Whether through medicine, policing, law, or continuing scientific debate, every path in this case begins with them. They are not simply the first chapter of the investigation. They are its enduring heart. The next chapter begins on the hospital floor itself, where a sequence of unexpected medical emergencies would slowly transform quiet clinical concern into a growing sense that something was happening which no one could yet explain, a series of moments that, viewed individually, seemed tragic, but viewed together would eventually alter the course of countless lives forever. The first incidents did not arrive with the clarity that hindsight often creates. They entered the daily life of the neonatal unit as medical emergencies, the kind of events every neonatal team is trained to confront. Premature infants can deteriorate rapidly, sometimes with little warning. Experienced clinicians know that even babies who appear to be progressing well may suddenly develop life-threatening complications. That reality shaped the way the earliest collapses were understood. Doctors and nurses responded with urgency, attempting to stabilize each child according to established neonatal practice. At that stage, there was no criminal investigation, no police involvement, and no suggestion that anyone inside the unit was deliberately harming patients. There were only critically ill babies, anxious families, and clinicians searching for medical explanations. During the period between June 2015 and June 2016, however, a number of babies experienced unexpected collapses that later became the focus of the investigation and the subsequent criminal trial. According to the prosecution, several of these infants had shown signs of relative stability before deteriorating suddenly. The prosecution argued that the pattern of these collapses could not be adequately explained by natural disease alone. The defense disputed that conclusion throughout the trial, arguing that premature babies are medically fragile, that unexpected deterioration is a recognized feature of neonatal medicine, and that the hospital was facing wider clinical and